Thank you, everyone, for coming here. It is time to kick off the Thursday, October 21st edition of the Vancouver Power BI Modern Excel User Group Meetup. Today, I'm going to be doing your presentation, but we're going to go through and do a little bit of an intro first. So we're already at the welcome and overview section here. In about 5 minutes, I'm going to turn it over to Joseph, who is coming to us live from Tofino on the west coast of Vancouver Island. It's one of the beautiful places in our province. It's about as far west as you can get without getting really, really wet. So he's going to be bringing that to us at about 6:05 our local time, and then I'll take over with the feature presentation once Joseph is done. I do want to kick off like we do with every meetup. Just a big thanks to the sponsors, Excelguru, which is my company, for putting all of this stuff together. Finding the speakers and including myself for tonight. SkillWave is our training division where we talk about all kinds of cool stuff like Power BI and Power Query and Power Pivots and Excel, all kinds of good things there. If you want to learn how to do the best things you can with your business intelligence, you should totally check out our collection of courses there. Big thanks to Microsoft for providing the software that gets us going here today. And also, I'd like to throw just a quick shout out for Monkey Tools. For those of you who are new to this meetup and haven't heard of this, this is an Excel add-in that I build that actually helps make your life a lot easier with Excel and Power Query and Power BI and Power Pivot, all those kind of things, all the Power Stack that are rolled into Excel. If you haven't checked it out, you really should. There's a free version you should see because it'll make your life a lot easier. Our next meetup that we have coming up on November 4th, we're going to be having Jakob Nielsen joining us from the Excel team. He's going to be talking about Power BI and Excel data types. Just a quick note on this one here. This does not start at a regular 6 p.m. West Coast time slot. Jakob is going to be joining us live from Europe. I believe he's going to be in, where is he going to be? I think he's going to be in Denmark. So that's why we're going to be starting that one a lot earlier. Of course, it will be recorded, but if you can make it, Jakob would love to have you here for that. It'll be great. And then our next Power BI track, I'm super excited to be welcoming Ed Hansberry. Ed's a recently minted MVP, does a ton of stuff with Power BI, and he's going to be talking about the skills your Power BI team needs to succeed. So this is going to be an interesting session as well. I can't wait to see that one as well. Just a quick note, because we're coming really, really close to that magic date of November 1st, my new book, Master Your Data, is out. You can pick it up in a digital version if you want the PDF or you want your Kindle versions. You can get those at skillwave.training. We sell the entire digital bundle all together. If you're in the US or Australia, you can actually get your print versions delivered now. You would go to the US Mr. Excel store, the top link on this slide, and these slides are already uploaded to the Meetup site. Matt is shipping from Accelerator BI in Australia as well, so you can pick those up now. For everybody else, including all of my loyal Canadian audience, November 1st is the magic day. If you would like to support us the best you can, please purchase your copies from the Mr. Excel bookstore for international customers, the bottom link. That will ship worldwide through the Independent Publishers Group and help support the authors a little bit more. Of course, if you do feel like supporting Jeff Bezos and his trips into space, you can always buy it from Amazon, and we just know that works everywhere, right? So there we go. So that book is coming very, very soon if you don't have it already. I'm super excited. I got my copies this week, which is awesome. Very excited. And I got to tell you, of all the books I've ever held, this one is this has got a satisfying weight to it. It feels pretty good. So highly recommend you pick up a copy. There's all kinds of good stuff in there. Finally, last thing I want to say is if you are interested in trying your hand at some meetup speaking and whatnot, we would love to have you. Please fill out this little survey here at excelguru.ca/speak@VanPUG. Whether you're talking about Excel or Power BI, we just love for people to share the things that they're doing. So please, take a chance at it. I think you'll find that the audience is really receptive, really engaged, and would love to have you here. Awesome. And at that point, my little slide deck is going to fade to black at this point. So, Joseph, I think we can actually turn this one over to you if you're ready to go.
Yeah, let's do it. Are you doing any signings of the new book or any plans for that?
Well, I mean, I could potentially be convinced to do something like that. You think I should actually have a signing at like chapters locally or something like that?
Nanaimo branch, I think so.
Well, we do have one. I don't know. I'm not sure. I can walk in or wander into chapter and say, "Don't you know who I am?" Right? Where's my book? And they probably won't have it. So
that's awesome.
We shall see. So awesome. All right, I can see your screen, so I think you are good to go.
All right. Well, thank you, Ken, and welcome everybody to the latest month of What's New in Power BI. So I'm going to be looking at the October feature release, which came out a few weeks ago. Usually don't have this much time to prepare. Sometimes we cut it as short as a day or even a few hours. So October's been a good one. Just before I jump in, my name is Joseph, guy filling the dead air, chatting with Ken before most of the meetup groups. I usually present the What's New in Power BI every month at the Vancouver Power BI meetup group. I have my website, feathersanalytics.com, up there, as well as my Twitter and my LinkedIn handle. I'm a senior financial analyst for the Business Intelligence and Data Analysis program at Corporate Finance Institute. So I build training and learning material around a whole array of business intelligence and data analysis, data science tools. So like Python, R, Power BI, Tableau, Excel, you name it, we probably have a course or a course on the roadmap for that. And that's really one of my passions, is integrating more advanced analytical programming languages like Python and R into Power BI. And so you'll find some of those blog posts on my website. And maybe even a featured presentation for the Power BI meetup group coming up at some point. But with that, enough about me. Let's jump into the session for today. Where are we? Here we are. So as always, whenever there's a new feature release or a new monthly update to the Power BI desktop application, we can always find a feature summary blog post on the Microsoft website. And so typically they break down and group these new features, either preview features or maybe some are made generally available, into a few different sections. So we have reporting, modeling, data connectivity and preparation, which are usually Power Query functionality, and so on into some further sections down here. So typically I like to focus on the reporting and the modeling new features, because I feel like those are the ones that the majority of Power BI users will leverage. It's a little light on those features this month. We've had a lot of updates in sort of the service, some of the embedded analytics, the admin and governance and development side as well. But for today, I'm just going to cover a few of my favorites, either in the Power BI desktop app or just bringing them to attention, just going over in a little bit more detail than the blog post does. So as always, I'm not going to have time to get through everything on the list, so I definitely recommend this as your first stop go-to resource if you are interested in what's new in Power BI, or if you have any further questions from what I cover in the presentation, or you feel like I missed something, definitely check out the blog post or feel free to contact me on LinkedIn and Twitter that I had up earlier as well. So my first favorite feature from this month is this new heat map layer in the Azure Maps visual. So this feature is in preview. And if I go back into my Power BI desktop application, I'm actually in the Power Query editor to start, because the data set I'm using to demonstrate this new Azure heat map layer comes from an R package. So just using 2 lines of code here, I've already installed this maps package in RStudio in my instance of R. So I'm just calling that maps package. And then using this data argument, this package comes with a built-in data set. So I'm using the US cities data set, and I'm bringing that into Power BI so that we can visualize the data with this new feature with the Azure map visual. So if you are familiar with Python or with R, and you do want a data set to play around with some features in Power BI, this is definitely something I think is underutilized and we can use to sort of play around with as well. So just wanted to bring that to everyone's attention before I jump in to the map itself. So if I go back in here, the Azure map visual is this little icon here in the visualizations pane. It is native in the Power BI now. And I'm just going to drop in from that query the latitude and the longitude in there. And if we take a few minutes, by default, we have some bubbles on a map of the United States. And I can use the population to help drive the size of the bubble. So we can see Los Angeles down here has a big bubble, New York has one. And if we want to add to the legend, I could say maybe, let's look at that by state. So now we can clearly see the state lines of all these cities by their population. So if we go to the visualizations or the format tab on the visualizations pane, if we scroll down, this is usually where the heat map layer would appear. But because I have a legend, this heat map layer is not available to us. So that's something just to keep in mind, that if you do want to use this heat map, you have to turn the legend off. And if I go back to the paintbrush roller in the format pane, we now have heat map. So if I turn that on, we can have both bubbles and heat map enabled at the same time. I'm just going to turn bubbles off because I think it's a little bit easier to see the heat map when it stands alone. And we have the ability to do all sorts of formatting with this. My high gradient color, if I want to change that to a dark purple maybe. So we can change this to be more on the red scale than the blues. And we can also change the radius of some of this heat map as well. So if I drop that down to 10, everything becomes a little bit more spread out and maybe a little bit easier to see and read as well. So new heat map layer, just a different option than using sort of the standard bubbles when you're using Azure Heat Map. Add something a little bit different to your Power BI dashboard. I think it's a really cool feature. So let's go back to the Power BI, what's new in Power BI blog post. And the second feature that I want to be looking at is the direct query for Power BI datasets and Azure Analysis Services. So I actually have looked at this a few months ago now of how we can use direct query to our published Power BI datasets in the service and bring in either an entire data model or specific tables from that data model to supplement an existing data model in one of our Power BI reports. But what we're able to do now, if I just go to this section of the blog post, is instead of importing the entire model by default, we can just bring in particular tables, which is really nice. And there's been some performance improvements as well, which we can read more about if you're interested in some of the feature documentation. So what that would look like is if you are in a workspace in the Power BI service, like I have here, I have two data sets. Rather than importing the entire data set, we could just go and bring in one or two tables if we don't need the whole data model. So that's really useful, particularly when we're getting into some more enterprise solutions. If you have corporate published data sets and you want to bring that in to a Power BI report and either use some of your own some tables maybe from your own desktop and build sort of a hybrid model that way. The next feature that I really liked is some performance optimization over the switch function in DAX. So we actually saw some syntax improvements with DAX over the last few months. It's been occurring in a lot of the monthly updates for Power BI. This optimization only really improves performance if you have hundreds or more values within your switch function, or if your switch function references DAX measures themselves. So if you haven't seen the switch function before, I've built one in the my workbook here. So if I just zoom in a little bit, what switch does is it can essentially replace a multi-layered or a nested if statement. So what this switch statement is doing is we're looking at the selected value of our country column, and if it equals California, we want to return the value of West Coast. If it equals New York, we can return the value of East Coast, and so on. And if it doesn't equal any of these values, it's other. So this works exactly like nested if statements. It's just that the syntax is a lot cleaner, and it can give you some more flexibility if you want to use some different DAX measures and aggregations in here. This is just a really simple one. And now if we were to layer hundreds of these clauses, the performance would be a lot better. One of the last features that I want to look at for this month, if I scroll down to the deployment pipeline APIs in the service. So what this allows us to do is set up automated deployment pipelines in the Power BI service. So previously, if we did want to take data sets and reports through different workspaces, we would have to do this manually, but now we can leverage some APIs in order to do that. So this is definitely more on the developer side of Power BI. If you're just a report user or report author, this might not be relevant, but from a data governance point of view, this is going to make it a lot easier to work with Power BI in a more mature setup. So this feature was in preview from the last couple of months, and now it's generally available. So this is awesome. If you're using Azure Data Factory, this is something we can look at as well. So I think this is a really cool feature that I'm looking forward to jumping in and building on and sort of learning a little bit more about. Then the last two features that I want to look at for this month is some of the new visualizations. So we have the out-of-the-box visualizations in Power BI, which we can find in the visualizations pane here. But we can also add to that. So we can either build a custom R or Python visual, or we can add some more visuals from the marketplace. So we can select the ellipsis to get more visuals, and we can either import a visual from a file that we may have on our desktop or in our files folder. But if I click on get more visuals, this takes us to the Power BI visuals marketplace. Here we go. And then this is where we can search for any visuals that may suit a very specific need within our report that might not be possible in any of the out-of-the-box visuals. So my favorite one was the lollipop chart, which I've already loaded from Nova Silva. It comes in both a bar and a column chart for this lollipop. So we can search for any visuals up here, or we can scroll down and the little check mark indicates that it's Microsoft certified. I've already loaded this to my report. So I'm going to select the lollipop bar chart, and it works just like the regular bar chart or column chart in Power BI. I can drop in name onto my axes and total population onto my values. But one thing I like about lollipop charts as opposed to bar charts is that you can get a lot more values on your axes and it doesn't feel so dense. It's a little bit easier to view and understand because the bars are really thin and the lollipop on the end really makes it stand out. So this is one of my favorite custom visuals. It's definitely possible to build this using R or using Python visuals, but it's also nice to have a more out-of-the-box way to do this by importing this visual from the marketplace as well. So with that, that was me. Those are some of my favorite features from Power BI this month. As I said, please feel free to contact me or connect on Twitter or LinkedIn. Love connecting with the data community, especially at the Vancouver Power BI user group. If you have any questions about anything that I went over today or anything that I may have missed, please let me know. But with that, really excited to hand it back to Ken. I know he's doing the feature presentation and looking forward to hearing what he has to say about queries and parameters in Power BI and when to use them. So with that, back to you, Ken.
Awesome. Thank you, Joseph. Appreciate, as always, the rundown of what's new. That is fantastic stuff. Okay, so here we go. First off, I just want to say I had a quick scroll through the list of everybody that's come, and I'd like to say thanks to all of you for showing up and coming to visit once again. I'm flattered that so many of you guys keep popping by for my stuff. Today's session that we're going to be dealing with is queries versus parameters. What's the difference? Which should use when? This was actually a challenging presentation to build for me. Part of the reason being because historically I've never been a big fan of parameters. I've used queries for that particular reason. But I kind of wanted to go through and explore these. And as I was writing the book, we really dug into them a lot more and whatnot. So this will probably end up changing over time the more I present it and whatnot, but just to give you sort of an idea as to what's going on, well, basically we're going to be doing a lot of demo inside of this thing with some summary afterwards. Now, Sorry, I need to get that out of the way. There we go. We'll just move that over there. So I do want to let you know, you can download the example files and slides. You can hit it with the QR code or pick it up from here. But there's an important thing around this particular set of data. When you actually get this one, it comes with a README file that tells you how to set it up, because everything that I am going to be doing today is all hosted on a SharePoint site. So you need to actually copy the data files to your own SharePoint and then actually make it work, which will make more sense after we've gone through this. So let's jump into to things. For those of you who do not know me, I think most of you do, but I mean, my name's Ken. Hi, this is me. I am, well, I mean, I run the Vancouver Power BI user group. I'm an Excel guy. I'm actually an accountant. That's my my sort of background and trade. I'm a fellow of the Certified or Chartered Professional Accountants and Certified Management Accountants of Canada. I run a little website called excelguru.ca where I've got a blog and a forum and a whole bunch of help articles. I'm also a Microsoft, wrong point, founding partner of SkillWave.training, as mentioned before, where we actually do a lot of business intelligence training around Power Query, Power BI, Power Pivot, and things like that. I'm also Microsoft MVP. I have received my award disc 15 straight MVP cycles, which is a huge honor for Microsoft. Spent 10 years as an Excel MVP, a few cycles in data platform, which is the category that looks after Power BI. I'm now back in Office Apps and Services, which is currently the category that looks after Excel. This is a big part of what I do in my life, is doing sessions like this and trying to help people and whatnot. So I very much appreciate Microsoft recognizing me on an annual basis for this award. The other thing that I do is I'm also a software developer and an author. We at Excelguru, we actually write and release the Monkey Tools add-in for Excel, which helps you work with Power Query and Power Pivots and Power BI and all kinds of good stuff. There's myself and one of my team, Abdullah. We're a team of two that actually build and release and support that add-in. If you haven't seen it before, you should totally check it out. There is a free version there, and it'll, as I say, it'll help you build better models faster and also audit them. And of course, I am an author. This is actually my third book. It is a complete rewrite of the first edition of M's for DataMonkey. If you want to learn lots about Power Query, whether you're a beginner or an expert, you should totally check out this book. There's lots of stuff to learn there. Now, that's about me. Let's move on to get into the stuff that we're going to be dealing with. But before we do, I just want to go through and define some terms as to what we're actually dealing with here, because I have some definitions that I use for things that may or may not be the same as what other people use for them. So I kind of want to round this out, just to make sure that when I'm actually speaking my language, that you guys understand what I'm actually talking about. As we go through this, by the way, if anybody wants to throw questions into the chat, I do actually have the chat window up on my left screen here that I will be trying to watch and whatnot. So I'll try to answer questions there as we go along as well. So first off, query. What the heck is a query? So basically, when I think about a query inside either Power BI or Excel, basically inside Power Query, I think about anything that reads from an external data source. This could return any kind of Power Query value. That could be a list, it could be a table, it could be a date, it could be whatever, it doesn't matter. But generally, when I think about a query, it's something that's reading from a data source most of the time. We also get into the concept of something else that we can call scalar queries. And scalar queries are queries, but they have a specific use case where they return a single primitive value. And that's my definition. Okay, so what this actually means is it's a query that returns a single date, a single number, or a single text-based value. The thing is that a scalar query can be derived from any query, including those with external data sources. As a matter of fact, a scalar query could reach out to an external data source, but by the time it's done, it's actually distilled everything down to a single value. That's a date, a number, or text, or logical, for example. The big thing that I want you to sort of understand, though, when I talk about scalar queries, I am not talking about a query that returns a list or table or a record. Those, to me, are not scalar values. Scalar means single. That's what it's all about. These complex objects or complex values of lists and tables, they're a little bit more structured, and therefore I would actually refer to those as a structured value rather than a scalar query. I also throw out this term here, and I actually emailed Miguel to try and find a better term for this one, but there really wasn't a good answer for it. So I'm just going to call it a simple query. A simple query, excuse me, to me, is something that returns, it is a single step query, only one step in the entire query that returns a scalar value. And it never reads from an external data source. And this is important because there is a certain feature inside Power BI and inside Excel and Power Query that only lights up if you're using one of these very, very simple queries, this single step thing that returns a scalar value. So you're going to see that as we go through the presentation today, where we actually need a query in a simple format in order to be able to actually leverage it. Now, that's queries. Let's talk about parameters. What the heck is a parameter? So let's start with, but query is from external source. Most of the time, yes. A simple query, no. A simple query cannot be from an external source. So thanks, Henry. That's an important thing. Yeah, as I say, you'll see this as we go through, because I'm going to make this very, very heavy example. This isn't going to be a massive theory presentation, because even the rules that I'm going to give you here, they're very gray, and this is one of the challenges here. So that's why I was kind of trying to define some things up front here. And actually, this is a good example. When I define a parameter inside Power BI, a parameter is created using the parameters dialog. You go manage parameters, create a new parameter. That's a parameter inside Power BI. If I'm looking in Excel, though, I have a completely different definition. Basically, any scalar value that's intended to drive other queries or filters, to me, is a parameter. Now, that could be the official parameters, but I tend to, in Excel, refer to a parameter inside Power Query, the official ones, as official parameters. There's a couple of reasons for this. The biggest one is that I built my get parameter function before Power Query parameters actually existed. So I'm that old. But my FN get parameter function, if you're familiar with that, it was in Emma's for Data Monkey. It existed on my blog before that. It's still covered in the new book here. That get parameter function returns scalar values. It doesn't actually truly return a parameter. But the way that we use them in Excel, that is how we actually use them, is to drive other queries and get a parameter in order to make things happen. So that's the first reason why in Excel I actually use this term to describe something different. Not old, just ahead of the curve. Okay, fair enough. I appreciate that, Eric. That makes me feel a little bit better, although I do notice I've got a lot less hair than I used to as well. Now, in Excel, I still use scalar queries in lieu of parameters in many, if not most, scenarios. And the reason being is because I actually find them much more functional for actually driving my scenarios in Excel. To me, parameters are one of those instances where when you look at Power Query, it seems that everything in Power Query gets built for Power BI first and then eventually makes its way to Excel. Parameters in particular are one of those features where I really feel that they were built very well for Power BI and they work really well in Power BI. But for Excel, they were kind of tacked on and they don't really do what we need them to do in Excel for Excel solutions. And that's kind of, now, that's not an official standpoint that probably anyone from Microsoft would agree with, but from my standpoint, that's basically what it is. If I need to actually get things done, I'm generally reaching to queries to drive as my parameters versus using the actual official parameters. Now, there are some exceptions to that, though, as well. Now, the good news is that today we're going to be doing everything in Power BI. So we're going to be looking at parameters via the parameters dialog, although I will make some call outs a little bit here and there as to how things get done. I'm going to cover two main demo cases as we go through this presentation here. I'm hoping that I come in within an hour-ish for this presentation, although you never know. It's one of the things that we know is it can sometimes tends to go long on these, but we'll see what happens. These are going to show a mix of queries and parameters being used to drive the solution throughout. And when I'm talking queries here, I'm actually talking about scalar queries and simple queries and regular old queries as well. So you're going to see a lot of different pieces here. The two main scenarios that I'm actually going to cover, the first one is a dev production switch, because no one likes waiting for refreshes of their queries when they're developing queries. There is nothing more painful than going through, adding a new step, and waiting for the entire freaking query to refresh and take 5, 10, 15, 20 seconds for that. So what I'm going to actually build here is I'm going to build a scenario where we use a parameter to control Are we pulling from a development data source, which only has 1 month of data, versus the production data source, which has everything? And we'll show you how that can actually come into play when we actually go and deploy it to the Power BI service, or even in desktop if you want. The other thing that I'm going to do is just recently, one of my clients brought me one of these in a self-service BI bootcamp AMA session. Is that I'm going to build a Fiscal Friday calendar. So this is a very special calendar. It's not one that I'd actually done before, but it's kind of an interesting one because in this particular calendar, the month end for every month is always on the final Friday of each month. That means that the year end is on the final Friday of the calendar year. So basically, if the final Friday of the calendar year is Christmas Day, well, that means that December 26th is actually part of the next year. So this actually leads to inconsistencies in the number of weeks per month. Now, I'm used to working with a regular old December 31st calendar. I know we got all kinds of issues around ISO weeks for years and things like that, dealt with 445 and 454 calendars and things like that. But this one was kind of an interesting one. So in order to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to build a custom Fiscal Friday calendar function, which is going to need some parameters to drive it and whatnot. So we'll see how those things actually play in. So again, this is going to be very, very demo heavy. As a matter of fact, we're going to be moving into a demo right now. The main session is going to be through this. And then once we're done with it, then I'm going to come back and I'm actually just going to do a little bit of a recap with some comparisons of when I would use one thing over the other. So as I say, you're going to see it in practicality first. And then we'll do a round out later on just to sort of, try and drive home the points that I was trying to make as we go through it. So hopefully that works for everybody. And again, the chat window is open here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and flip across over here to a Power BI file. Actually, I'm going to do something else first. Let me just go back to my demo, and I'm going to hit escape on that because I want my clock here so that I know approximately what time frame we're on and how much I'm going over. Okay. So I have a Power BI file. Now, when you open up, if you decide to download and open up the example files, you're actually going to get Power BI templates. So if you double click on that, it's going to prompt you for some information. I'm going to cover that near the end of the show. But for right now, I'm actually working with a file here that I've already started. And I'm going to go into transform data, and I'm going to show you what we're actually looking at here is we have a few things showing up inside here. We've got some queries, we have some simple queries, and we have a parameter. So the first one I'm going to call out is the file path parameter. This is an official Power BI parameter or Power Query parameter that came from manage parameters and new parameter. And if I take a look at it, it's got a name of file path. You'll notice that I've put in the description here. Please enter the complete SharePoint path where the data files are stored. I've said it's required. It's a text type. I don't care what the value is you put in there. I'm going to rely on you to get that right. And it basically takes the entire URL to where my data is actually stored. Okay, so all the way over to this data folder here. So I'm just going to say OK on that. So that's the first part. This is a parameter. Now, I also have a couple of simple queries here. You'll notice that this is a simple query because basically when you look in the formula bar, it just says kit 2312 XLSX. This is a file of food and beverage kits. That's how we refer to the billing information that you get when a server asks you to pay your bill. It's a kit that they give you. So now you're an expert in food and beverage. So this is just the December 2013 kit file. The Excel file prod gives me the all. Now, I said that it's a file. It's not. This is just text. That's all it is. And if I go and right-click on the advanced editor, you'll actually see that that's exactly what it is. We always have a let and in our query, and it's basically just setting it to a textual value. Okay, so it's a single step. It reads from no external data sources. This is a simple query. Meanwhile, over here at kits dev, we actually have a proper query, complex query. It has 3 steps. First one is called source. And in the source one, you'll notice that we are actually pulling the Excel workbook. We're pulling from web contents. We're feeding in the file path. This is the full SharePoint file path that we have from here. And we are going to append a trailing slash just to make sure that somebody's put one on the file path. And then we're adding in the kit name. So if you concatenate all that text together, the entire file path plus the kit 2312, that's being fed into web contents, which is then being extracted into Excel workbook that gives us all the names of the tables inside here. I'm navigating into the chits table. and I'm setting the data types on this. The important thing that I want you to notice here, the chits dev query is pulling data for a single month that starts in December 2013. Okay, so if I just go and oops, wrong one. If I just go and zoom in on that one for a second here, you can see that indeed we are looking at, nope, I don't know how I managed to get green. There we go, December 2013 here. I'm not a big Zoom It user. I'm trying that out for today here to try and be better than the stuff I was using the day before. So, so bear with me on that one. Now, chip prod is almost identical to chip dev. The difference is this is the production file. And you'll notice that it starts in 2009. You can also see some 2013 records in here. There's a heck of a lot going on inside this file. The deal is, though, when you look at source, it's the same thing. We've got our file path, which is reading from the file path parameter, adding the slash, and concatenating Excel file prod, which is, of course, it's all. The thing that I want you to recognize about what you're seeing here more than anything else is I am not stuck to using parameters or scalar queries. I can use both in one solution, and there are many, many reasons why you would want to do this. To change the color in Zoom It, tap R for red. Fantastic. Control 1, R, and oops, hang on a second, R, and then we'll just see. Fantastic. Thank you. Appreciate that. All right. Awesome. It's always awesome when I got people here who know how this stuff works. Okay, so back to the regularly scheduled part here. So basically what we've got here is we have two separate components that we're actually working with. Now, the big key that I'm looking for here is I want to make sure that I have a switch in place where I can choose to work with one file or the other, because I don't want to work with this one. Every time I try and add a step to it, it's going to take too long to recalculate. So the dev file is going to be a lot easier to work with. So I'm going to build myself a switching mechanism to make that happen. And to do this, I'm actually going to start with a parameter. So I'm going to go manage parameters. We're going to say new parameter. And for this guy here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to call it data file. The name's not super important, but this part actually is description. Which data file would you like to use, dev or prod? Now, you'll notice here that I'm giving you the options right in the description. I'm making this required. I'm going to set it to text. I will allow a list of values to be used for this, one of which is dev, and the other one is prod. I have very, very, very deliberately typed those items in here. This is not an accident. Okay, you're going to see why when we actually deploy to Power BI. The default value I'm going to choose in a real world would probably be prod, but I'm going to go with dev because I want it to do it that way. My current value is going to be dev as well. This way, I'm going to make sure I fall back to the easier data set to use. Okay, so we'll circle back on why this needs to be here, but notice that I've got a couple of values inside here. And I think I'm just going to move that into my parameters folder to keep it neat. What I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to go and right-click on chits dev here, and I'm just going to go and reference it. And that's going to give me a new query that I am going to call, actually, I'm going to call it staging-chits _chits because I want to be consistent. There we go. I'm going to right-click on this guy and disable the load, and I'm going to move it to my staging queries. The problem with this, of course, right now is it is referring to dev, and I want to be able to determine which one of these I want. So that's very easy to do. Up in the formula bar, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come here and I'm going to say if my data file equals dev, then we're going to use our chits dev, else we're going to use our chits prod. There we go. Remember, dev is 2013. We're still on dev. If I come back over here and change the parameter using my nice little list that I put in here to prod, and I jump back over to staging chits, notice we're now at 2009. So we're switching back and forth very, very easily by just going and saying, okay, cool, let's go change the value in the parameter. So I'm going to set this back to dev because that's the lighter one. And there we go. We've now got our values. Hopefully that makes sense so far. Now, what I'm going to do at this point is I'm actually going to very quickly go and spin up the data model that I'm going to need for my solution here. So all of that's going to be built off of staging here. I'm going to build all of the individual fact and dimension tables that I need. So I'm going to start by going right-click and we'll choose reference. The first one that we're going to start with here is this is going to be my items table. I'll just move it into my data model folder, keep organized. For that, I need my item and category. Go right-click, remove other columns. I'm going to remove any duplicates from my items here, and then I'm going to press Control-A to select all my columns, transform, detect data type. I appreciate that was really fast, but the point of this is parameters and queries, not how to build tables. So I'm going to do it again, just with a different table here. So we're going to go right-click. We're going to choose reference again. So everything's going to be built off of staging kits here. This one here, I'm going to make a separate dimension for kit IDs. Yes, I really do this. Right-click, remove other columns. Same basic steps here. We're going to go right-click and remove any duplicates just to make sure there aren't any in here. And then I'm going to set the data type to be a whole number, because I believe the last step you should always do for your data model tables is lock down every data type. If you work with dimensional models a lot, you can argue that I don't need to create a separate dimension for this guy here. I could just use the one from the fact table. I always put my dimensions in separate tables, even if it's only a single column. Creel's asking, do I create query subfolders under the data model folder to keep my dims and facts separate? Sometimes, not always, but you know what? Since you asked, you know what? Here we go. Oops, wrong one. Let's go move to group here. Oh, not move to group. Let's create a new group. There we go. We'll go and create this one. We'll call it dimensions. And both of these guys can go in there, and then we'll make a new group for facts. And we will go and create our fact table. So let's go right-click and reference this guy. He's going to be called Chit. I'm going to move that into my facts area over here. And I don't need the category because that was already part of my items table. So I'm good to go there. And then again, the last thing I'm going to do, Control-A, and detect my data types. Oh, actually, you know what? There is one more thing. So I'm going to back that up for a sec. I'm going to go and do something here. We're going to go add column, standard, multiply, and we're going to make a new column here called sales dollars, because I'm an accountant and it's all about the money that I made. So there we go. That will tell me my units times my amount gives me my revenue. Awesome. Now I'm going to go Control-A and detect my data types. Perfect. So those are the dimensional model tables that I need, except for one small problem. I got a date in here, and I want to be able to start going and analyzing things based on time periods, because if there's one thing that's important to accountants, it is how much did I make? And then if there's another thing that's super important to accountants, it's all about when did I make it? Because I want to be able to defer as much money as I can so I don't have to pay my taxes on it until I absolutely have to. So what I need in order to do that is I need a calendar dimension. Now you could leave it to Power BI to build one of those, but that's like super lazy. I'd say it's irresponsible, honestly. That is a horrible feature. I prefer to take much more granular control of my calendars, make sure I've got the right things in there. When I was building this demo, I actually forgot to turn off the auto calendar feature. And by the time I was done, I actually went and used Monkey Tools to re-import it into Excel. And I realized that after all the work that I'd done, I think it actually created about 9 date tables behind the scenes where it needed 1, right? So always do it yourself. It's just a safer thing to do. But how? Okay. What's my rule of thumb on referencing versus duplicating queries? Great question. I always reference, I never duplicate. I am a firm believer that you should always be trying as much as possible to reuse the work that you have. There is the casting of shared nodes that is actually built into the program. So for me, it's much more logical to go through and reference something so that I can actually see a chain that actually ends up happening, so I can trace my data through. So if I'm looking at this right now, for example, we can actually see that, I'm pulling my data into this area here. I come into staging kits and I can see where it's going here. If I start duplicating this, I'm going to end up with a bunch more information. Yes, Henry, you're absolutely right. I need my Fiscal Friday calendar as well. Brent is asking, do I want a PQ calendar or a DAX? Can you build a Fiscal Friday calendar in DAX? Maybe you can, but if, and George says that's a religious question. Well, let me tell you about my religion. It's Power Query, period. That's it. Never anything other than that, ever. So, and I'm glad to see that I'm not the only one. Thank you, Krill, for backing me up on that. Now, I will say never. I will never use a DAX calendar ever. I would not say that you don't have to use a DAX calendar. If you would prefer to, by all means, whatever you decide is right, it's your model, right? So, I don't like my users to come into Power Query. Can we give dev prod as a drop-down in a visualization? You can report on it that way, yeah. So here's the deal. Fantastic. I'm going to come back to that because this is actually a really important point about flipping this little switch here and where you do it. And this actually is a big thing why I don't like them in Excel, but I'm okay with them in Power BI. So you'll see this when it comes out a little bit later. All right, let's get to this calendar because the calendar is both kind of fun and also starts to illustrate a few more different things. So the first thing that I need to do is I want to build a calendar and I want it to go from a couple of different dates. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a couple of new queries to drive things. And I'm doing this deliberately to start with here. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to say new query, and I'm going to create myself a very simple query here. This simple query is going to look like this, 2021-01-01. Okay, so this is a date, and you can see that it actually changes the icon to be a date. So we've got a single scalar value that does not read from an external data source. I'm going to go and call this one start date _ P. That's not how you spell date, so let me just fix that because that will drive me crazy. All right, I'm going to make another one too. Right click, new query from blank query. This one is going to be 2021-12-31. Let me see if I can spell 2021 correctly. There we go. And this one is going to be end date _ P. All right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to build a sample of my calendar that I'm going to turn into a function. I need to start from somewhere. So this is where it's going to start. So now I'm going to build myself my calendar template. Okay. Would a user flip the dev prod switch? Depends. I mean, I'm trying to make this easy for the developer, to be honest with you. So, and you'll see that there's places where you can actually control these kind of things, right? The reality that you want to think about here too is if you publish it, who actually controls the dev switch or the switch? The person that publishes it. The author isn't, or the reader isn't going to get a chance to do that. Whoever's in Power BI Desktop should be able to change it because you're going to deploy it through the service when you're good to go. So keep that in mind as well. So anyway, we'll come back to all that kind of stuff, I promise. So here we go. Let me create a new query here. This is going to be for my sample calendar. Okay. And what I want to do is somebody in the meeting muted me somehow. I didn't know that you guys had that power. So there we go. All right, so I'm going to build a sample calendar here. This is going to use the same format to begin with that I use for my standard Power Query recipe for building a calendar, which basically means it's going to start like this. We're going to start with equals curly bracket. I am updating my patterns to use int64.from instead of number.from, okay? And we're going to start with the start date P. The reason I'm using int64 is that int64 automatically truncates decimals, which means that somebody can feed this a date time instead of just a date, and it will still work. Okay? The number.from, it would blow things up. So here we go. We're basically going from the date serial number from the start date to the date serial number and end date, which will create a list. I'm going to convert that to a table and click OK. I'm going to go and say dates to get my date serial numbers back into the date format and label that as a date. Okay. I've now created the most basic calendar ever, every single day between the start date and the end date. Okay, so that's a standard Power Query recipe pattern. I've shown this for a long time. It's in MS for Data Monkey. Sorry, no, I think it was in MS for Data Monkey actually. It's in Master Your Data. It's in our Power Query Academy. It's in my recipe cards. You can find this all over the place. I'll give you links to that later as well. But things are going to get a little different here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add some columns to drive my fiscal Friday. So we're going to add a year. We're going to go back to date, and we're going to add a month number. We're going to go back to date, and we're going to add a day of week. Okay, so 3 new columns for this. Now, the deal is, in Power Query, the day of week, Sunday is 0, Monday is 1, and so forth. That means Friday is 5, and Saturday is 6. So in order to figure out which day is my fiscal Friday, I am going to filter this down to only use day number 5. So this is now all of the Fridays from the start to the finish. What I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to grab my year and my month, go transform, group by. So I'm going to group by year and month. And in order to get the end of month, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the max of the date. Okay. I'm also, while I'm here, because it's convenient, going to make a nice weeks in month column as well, which is going to be based on a count of the rows. Actually, I'm going to use this later too. So it's not just for convenience. When we say OK, you'll notice that it groups things up quite nicely here. Now, the important thing that I want you to recognize about what's going on in this thing is actually the number of weeks in month, because you would be forgiven if you looked at the first few rows and said, oh, this is just a 5-4-4 calendar pattern, 5-4-4, 5 weeks, 4 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 4 weeks, 4 weeks, until we get to here. 5 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. Ah, that screwed up everything. Okay, so for a standard calendar pattern for a 4-4-5 or variant pattern, you need these to be consistent. Well, this one's not. And there are times when you will actually get, you could potentially get something that actually goes with one more week, a 53-week year as well. So this is the trick with this one, getting the right number of weeks per month here in order to drive this calendar. In this year, it happens to end December 31. Nice and convenient. With this in place, what I need to do is go and get the other columns that I'm going to need here as well. Now, I'm going to build one day a recipe for this. I haven't got one yet, so you'll have to follow the video later if you're interested. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new one right now called Start of Month. And the way that Start of Month works is it's going to be a date dot add days. We're going to start with the end of month. And what we're going to add to the end of month is -7 times. We're going to multiply that by the weeks of month and add 1. Or at least we're going to add 1 if we can get back into the box where we can type. And we're going to close the parenthesis. Okay, so let me just go and zoom in on that one just a little bit so people can actually see that. Okay, so basically we're taking the ending month date. We'll multiply the number of weeks in the month here by -7. Okay, and then we'll add 1 to that. When we do that, what happens is we get a start of month date here. Now, the important thing to notice when we actually go and look at these guys here is that, let me see if I can get this right. Nope, it's not control. Is it shift? Come on. All right, guys, what's arrows again? I know that there's a way to deal with this one here. I can, I'll do something there. Isn't it control shift or something like that? There we go. Please describe what a recipe is and where you store it. Sure. A recipe is simply a prescribed set of steps, and I actually have a whole bunch of recipes in a document that I will share a link to later on where you can actually pick those up. Okay, so here's control shift. There we go. So we're starting on December 26th. That's the start of this particular month. So in December, or in 2020, December 25th was actually the last Friday. So 26th is going to be the first one. And it ends here on January 29th. And you can see then when we actually go and work down here, the next month starts on January 30th. So we go from the 29th to the 30th to the 26th of February to the 27th of February. Okay, so the start of month is obviously one day after the end of the previous month. The main thing I want to show you here is it is actually working. Okay, so that's the first part. The next piece that I need to do is I need to get the start of year. So this is actually going to use a conditional column. And for the start of year, what I'm going to do is I'm going to check if the month equals 1. And if it does, we're going to select a column, which is going to be the start of month. Otherwise, we put in a null. So obviously December 26th, that's the first day of the year. From here, fill down. Okay, we've now got the start of the year nailed off. Going to build one for end of year. So end of year also uses a conditional column. So what we're going to do is we're again going to check if the month this time equals 12. And if this feels dangerous, don't worry, I promise I'm not going to mess this up. What we will do is we will grab the end of month for this one. And now right click and fill up. The big secret on this whole thing, of course, is making sure that our calendar patterns actually have the start and the end in order to be able to get the proper year end on this. And that's something that I take care of when we actually start building this into a dynamic scenario. Now, I've got my year, my month, the number of weeks in the month. I've got the start of the month, the end of the month, the start of the year, and the end of the year. What I need to do now is I need to expand this calendar table so that it covers every day in the entire period that picks up the correct start end dates for these things. To do that, I'm actually going to re-leverage that calendar pattern. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my custom column here. I'm going to make a new custom column called date. And for this guy here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with this. We're again going to go back to our list construct for creating a list of numbers. This is going to be, once again, an int 64. So I'm going to take my start of month on each row, convert it into a date serial number, and then I'm going to go up to int 64.from all the way up to the end of the month. If I can find it, there it is. Close the parenthesis and close the curly brace. Okay, so this is exactly what I did to start, except that when I started, I was using start date and end date, which were year end dates. This time, I'm actually reading from the starting month and end of month. This is going to create that same calendar format, a list of numbers in each one of these cells here. So we can see that here down the bottom. Once I'm done with it, I can expand this to new rows, change these to a date, and you can now see that we have the dates for every single day within the start and end of month period. Big key thing here is that I now have my fiscal Friday month end associated with every individual date here as well. You can set the data type in the add conditional column in Excel. I'm gonna have to go back and check that one out. If you can do it in Excel, I'm sure you can do it in Power BI. I can't say that I've actually played around with that too much, but it may just be because I've been doing this too long and haven't noticed. So, okay, so here's the thing though. What I'm going to do at this point is I'm now actually, and this is just a cosmetic thing, I'm going to reorder some data here. So I'm going to move my dates across the left-hand side. I'm going to put my weeks and month over here, and I'm going to put my start of month before my end of month, start of year, end of year. That all looks good. The last thing, Control A, transform, detect data type. Now, these guys are all samples that are meant to build a function, which means I don't want any of these to load to the data model. So right click, enable load, or disable load rather, disable load, disable load. What I really, really want right now is I want to take this and turn it into a function so that it can actually dynamically react to the dates here, because I can change this. I mean, I can come back and say, hey, let's go with 2013. If we go back, you can see that my calendar now starts December 12th or December 29th, 2012. So this is absolutely working, which is great, but I don't really want to be trying to make that kind of a change here. I want to actually feed this and feed it dynamically from data. So to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually turn this into a custom function. And the easiest way to do this, if everything's working right, is you can do this. Right click, create function. Fantastic. Except that it says, hey, I can't find any parameters. Are you sure you want to create a function without parameters? Well, that's not going to help me at all. Well, I mean, might, but it's not the ideal way to do things here. So the create function requires a proper parameter. So I'm not going to do this. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to convert these guys into proper parameters. In truth, if I was doing this in the real world, I would have created these as parameters right from the get-go. I only did this because I wanted to show you that once you have a simple query, you can right-click on it and convert it to parameter. The only way you can get this button to light up is to have a simple single-step query that returns a scalar data type. That doesn't seem like much, but there's a lot going on there. I was wondering why I could never get this stupid button to become active. And it's because my queries always had more than one step. That's the challenge. So once we've got that, you can create it as a parameter, right click, convert to parameter. Okay, cool. So we got both of these, but a couple of things I want to show you about this. I'm going to make some changes to this parameter as well. Start date P is fine as a description, but I am going to go in here and I'm going to actually type something into this. I'm going to say, if you're going to fill, oops, let's put in the extra word here, to fill this in, make sure it is a valid January 1 date. And I'm just going to go copy all that. I am not going to make it required. I will allow anything to go into this particular guy here because I want it to accept date times because my sample calendar is smart enough to actually deal with that. So I'm going to go back over to end date. We're going to uncheck the required there, paste this in, and make sure that this one is actually a December 31 date. I got to tell you, filling in descriptions to fields actually makes me feel a little bit dirty because I'm like an Excel pro, right? Like we never document anything, so this is kind of weird. But trust me on this, it's a really good idea. So now that I've actually done this, I'm going to say okay. So the parameters are all fine. And if I go back and look at my sample calendar, it's still working, so that's all good. But now you'll notice there's a big difference. When we go right-click on this and create function, it goes in here and it says, all right, what do you want to call it? And it notices that the parameters, start date and end date P, are now being used here. So I can go in and call this one X or FXFF calendar for Fiscal Friday calendar. And when I say okay, it's going to go and create this. It moves everything all into one place here. So why set the year only and not the full date in the parameter? The full date, it is a full date in the parameter here. So yeah, I'm not 100% sure where that question was sort of going, Henry. That is a full date that we're actually looking at there, and it needs to be a full date in order to work. If I had set it to be just a year, I would have had to build it very, very differently. So, okay, big important point around this. After creating FF or the FXFF calendar, I now have something that I can actually use in order to create myself a new query, which is good. It's driven by these two parameters, which is also good. But the most important part about this, the sample calendar is live based on these two values, which means that if I decide that, hey, you know what, I want to go back and I want to add a new measure to this for whatever reason, I want week of month, for example, well, or week of year, for example, I could come back and make the changes right inside sample calendar here. And as soon as I leave, they automatically get updated into this. And this is one of the really great things about using parameters and a sample to drive this. You can't necessarily do that with queries. Okay? So that's even simple queries, something to keep in mind. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to come here and I'm going to go and try and invoke this. So here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, hey, let's go and just use the start date. So start date underscore P and end date underscore P. Let's use those. Invoke. An error occurred. Fantastic. Why? Well, because if we actually look really carefully at this thing, what did it do? Well, it didn't actually feed it the parameters here. What it did is it actually wrapped them in quotes. So that's not cool. So if we get rid of those quotes, we'll get rid of that one. We'll get rid, oops, let's not get rid of the E. Let's get rid of that quote there. You'll notice that it just worked. So at this point, I can feed my calendar directly from a parameter. The only challenge with this is that this is dealing with 2020 data. And if I go and take a look at my chits over here, this is 2013 data. So I really want it to be driven from this data, not this one. And this is one of the things that actually drives me crazy about parameters and why, well, this section here, and is one of the reasons why I actually avoided them for a long time. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back and I'm going to actually dynamically generate the start date and end date for my data. So to do this, I'm going to go right-click on staging here, and I'm going to choose to reference it. And I'm going to go and call this one start date underscore Q, the Q in this case, because I'm using a query, not a parameter. And I'm going to go through a very quick recipe that I use for generating calendar tables all the time. Right-click on date, remove other column. We're going to go and filter, date filter for is earliest. We're going to right-click and remove duplicates. That gets me down to a single date here. We're going to go transform, date, year, start of year. That will get me back to the beginning of the year. Always force it to be a date, even though it already is, because that way, when we right-click on this guy and choose drill down on the data, not the header, we get a single scalar value that refers to row 0 of the previous query. If you don't convert it to a date first, sometimes it actually hard codes the date right in here, which is really, really bad. Okay, so you don't want that. So that's the start date Q. Now here's the thing. I'm thinking, well, hey, I just want to use that as a parameter. Right-click, Can't convert to parameter. Why? Multiple steps, reads from an external data source. Okay? Can't convert it to a parameter. Frustrating. All right, let's go and do the end date here real quick. Reference. This is going to be end date underscore Q. Okay. Same thing. Right click, remove other columns, but this time we will filter for date filters is latest. Right click, remove duplicates. Date, transform to year, even though it already is end of year. This way I can guarantee if somebody only uploads data for 6 months, I'm still forcing it to the end of the year, which is important to drive the fiscal Friday calendar pattern. Convert it to a date, right click, drill down. Okay. Now, what do I want to do? Well, I really want to drive my calendar, which by the way is a dimension, so let's move it in there. I want to drive it from this value, 2013. So can I do that? Well, the answer is yes. So all I need to do in order to make that happen, because this query is only one letter different, is just change the start date Q. Okay. Now I'm going to leave the other one here for P for a second, but you'll notice that as soon as I do that, it's now working nicely. Okay. I could actually change the other one to Q as well. But I want to say something different here, because I know that if I don't show you this, somebody's going to come back and say, yeah, but Ken, you blogged about this and you just retweeted that this is one of the popular things on your blog. So maybe why didn't you cover it? So here's the deal. Can we make the parameter dynamic so that it reads from this value? And the answer is yes, we can. There's a couple of things to be aware of around this. Number one, there is no way through the user interface that I can do this. There's no way through manage parameter that I can do this. In order to make this dynamic, what I need to do is I need to actually go into the advanced editor. This is where the hard-coded date that you see here is stored, right in front of this tag called meta. Okay, so I can change this out to be anything that I want. I can change this out to be start date Q, which is reading dynamically from something. When I say OK, you'll notice that it just gives me a ... and it wipes this out. But if I go back to my calendar, notice that it's now starting in 2013. So it does work, okay? But here's the problem. I'm now reliant on the parameter. And as you're going to see later, it is possible for people to overwrite these if they don't know what they're doing, because all they can do is come in here and go, hey, guess what? I'm going to put this in as 2021-01- whatever, because I want to go and modify my sample transform. Well, as soon as I do that, and I come back over here, this is now 2020 again, and guess what? This is no longer pointed at start date Q. So this user interface leads you to break the query. That's a bad news thing. What about if we don't want to even have start date Q? I mean, this is the other thing. It seems silly. Why would I create start date Q and then create a start date P parameter and link it? I get two objects here. Could I do even a little bit better? Well, I could go to advanced editor. I could grab all of this code. I could come over to advanced editor here. And what I could do is I could say open parenthesis. Let me just delete all that. Paste my entire block of code that I just copied out of start date Q. It gives me the ... But guess what? It's going to take a little longer to load, but calendar is now working, 2013, because it is reading from the same thing that start date Q is reading from, even though it's now all internal here. Okay, so now I don't actually need start date Q anymore. I could actually delete that. But this still leaves you in the same spot where somebody can come in and overwrite something here. And this is where things actually get really, really scary, because if your parameter, if you open this up, your current value doesn't show anything. It would be so awesome if this would just read like, hey, this is a scalar query, get me the value, but it doesn't. If you put this on required and try and leave, it gives you an error here. So you can't even leave. So this has to be empty in order to go and say, okay. And at this point now, my sample calendar just blew up because something's gone sideways here. It's now realizing this is a null because when I committed it, it's not actually reading it properly here. So honestly, you can link these together, but don't. It's not the right way to do things. The reason why I pursued that at the very beginning of this is because I have a really strong background in VBA coding, and what I know about variables is that variables need to be initialized and set to a value before you can actually use them in the real world. And I want my parameters to work that way. but that's not the way that they actually work. So it's a little bit about getting used to the structure and understanding how it's actually works rather than how you think it should necessarily work. Okay, so in this case, we're going to leave these guys as parameters to drive our sample, but these two scalar queries, which I'm noticing right now need to be disabled because I don't want to load them to the data model, those are what I'm going to use to drive my calendar. So I'm going to come back and just change these two guys here to point to the query version of start date and end date, which is being dynamically driven and will now return from 2013 through to the end. Okay. I hope that makes sense. I know there's a lot of sort of bouncing around back and forth in some of these things here, but it gives you the idea of some of the components that we can actually play with. Now, awesome. I'm glad that some of you guys are finding this. I'm not sure about crazy, but awesome is good. Hopefully it's a good crazy. So here's the deal though. Before I actually close this down, I've pretty much done everything I need to do in here, but I also want to show you one quick little, kind of a little diversionary kind of component here that I haven't shown you around, Henry, the conclusion, query is better. Maybe, but let me show you this. I'm going to go into chits for a second here. I'm going to add a filter to my date to say I want to have dates that are later than a certain point in time. Okay, so I'm going to come into date filter and I'm going to say after. Okay, so I want to make sure that it's after start date Q. Can I do anything about that? Well, I can get the dates. I can pick from a calendar, which will give me hard-coded dates. I can choose a date, which gives me the same things that I was just looking at. I can choose from a parameter or a new parameter, but notice that I cannot call from a scalar query. This drives me freaking mental. I want the ability to actually use start date Q right here from a dropdown. I absolutely want that. This is why I was trying to figure out how can I dynamically populate this guy with the results from this query, because I want to be able to use just like parameter here, which I can pick in this query. The problem is start date P won't work because that's a 2021 value and I'm working with 2013 values, so it's not going to really work. But I can go back and change this to start date Q and it works just fine. So this is a challenge, right? So the thing that you want to recognize about this is that parameters will show up in the user interface as drop-down options, but queries don't. So do we have to have another parameter to tell the system we want parameter query? Well, yes and no. There we go. So, do we need to have another parameter? I mean, we could, but honestly, for me, if I'm going to do this, I actually just set a filter manually and then overwrite it with the query that I actually want to use instead. Now, I don't want to use that here, but it is one of those things that's a little bit frustrating. I really wish, I mean, the Power Query team knows that this evaluates to a scalar. How do they know? Because they put a date icon on. They even know the data type. So why can't that go into a filter? This is a scalar, it's text. I mean, that's a parameter, right? You'll see other items in here for like lists and things like that. So if the data type is compatible, why can't that fill into that particular area for dropdown? I don't understand that. It frustrates me intensely. But that is one benefit that you get, is that parameters, are something that we can work with. Eric, you're worried that I was going to say it was bad practice to use a query in your filter? I do that all the time. I mean, that's a standard thing here, and I'll use them over parameters. Again, there's a reason coming up for that. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go now. I got everything done that I need to do here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to load this to the data model here. So we'll go and say close and load. And we're going to let or close and apply. We're going to let all this kind of stuff cook away here. Remember, we're working with our dev file. So this is the smaller file, but it is reading from an Excel file stored on my SharePoint. And I'm running a Teams call, which is always good for making things run a little bit slower. So the first thing I do need to do is I need to hop over here and take a look at my modeling view, because I've got, oops, wrong one. Here we go. I'm going to move things around to where I actually want them. Build my nice little star schema here. That one's going to be dates, going to go there. Got it lined up nicely. Cool. Going to go hide all of my dimensional fields so that only my facts are left on my chits table. That is cool. If I had a lot of time, I'd actually go and build some proper measures, but I'm not going to waste my time with that. You guys all know how measures actually work here. Okay, so here's the deal. Let's build a couple of visuals. So the first one, we're going to go and build something that shows us our categories, and we're going to go to our chits. I'm going to use units because that's what I used in the sample file. So there we go. We got a nice bunch of units and whatever else. So that's all cool. Pretty simple visual. Now we're going to go and we're going to build a little line chart that goes across here. And on this one, I'm going to go and put for my calendar, I'm going to put end of month on it. And I'm going to put my units on there as well. Now, this chart looks a little bit underwhelming, maybe, only because we only have one end of month in this because there's only 1 month of data. So if I wanted to, I could always go and slide date underneath this and drill down. And you can see that we actually have real data that's here. But I'm just going to drill up here and I'm going to take that off because I don't really need it anyway. So there's my data. Now, here's what I want you to recognize. One of the questions, I think, Santosh, it might have been you that brought this up and said, I don't like sending my users into Power Query to change things. And I agree. That's actually one of the things that drives me nuts. If I go to transform data right here, I have edit parameters right on the Home tab in Power BI. This is awesome. This is something that Excel does not have. And this is one of those reasons why I say it's like these were built for Power BI, but they forgot to implement them all the way inside Power Query. I've actually looked with Monkey Tools at the feasibility of adding edit queries right to the ribbon inside Excel in Monkey Tools. But as it turns out, there's a whole lot of complexity in this that I just looked at and went, I don't know if it's worth the dev time. We'll see. It might happen in the future. Big deal is all 4 of the official parameters we created are here. Notice start date P, or end date P, which are parameters, are here, but start date Q and end date Q are not because they're not parameters, they're queries. My file path is here, complete with my little notes. Make sure this is the full SharePoint path, and we get a nice little drop down for dev or prod. Fantastic. I'm going to go and hit prod, and then I'm going to hit apply changes. Why, when I change a parameter, it doesn't automatically apply changes? I'm not sure. I'm sure there's a reason for it, but it actually makes me click twice and wear out my mouse button. Not that I'm bitter at all. Anyway, I'm not sure how long this is actually going to go and take to refresh. Hopefully, it'll only take about a minute. But I'm hoping that you guys are getting the idea here that there's a mixture of different pieces in this between queries and parameters for what we're actually working with. So this should go and get a bunch more data. If all works well, it will actually complete the query here, and we should see a nice little line chart that actually comes up along the bottom here with multiple months. But of course, because I'm on a Teams call, it's going to go and take a lot more times. So listen, Jim, no, you don't get any lollipops. That's Joseph's thing. That's not my thing. But I appreciate the comments that you guys are enjoying this. That's cool. Loving that. Hey, there we go. Perfect. Awesome. Buttons or bookmarks to save parameters would be interesting. Indeed, wouldn't they, though? There we go. All of our data's come in. So the nice thing about this is that by using this dev prod switch, I was actually able to build my queries with little latency. And then when I go to do the refresh, it then goes and pushes that whole thing out. And I'm sure that all of you who've worked with substantial data sets have felt the pain of, I'm going to rename a step and then wait for 20 seconds while your query recalculates. And then I'm going to put in a filter and wait for 20 seconds. I don't like doing that. So that's what this is all about. Okay, so here we go. I'm just going to go and mark this back to dev because I want that for the demo I'm about to do here. So we'll apply changes. This one's hopefully go a little faster. The big thing is it works. Okay, so that's the first part. The structure behind this, by the way, is that one of the files is just a whole lot more data. The other one, I actually grabbed the entire data set, filtered it down to just December 2013, cut it, pasted it in another file, and saved it, and I used that. So it's the exact same structure. Yeah, that's all it is. All right, now, file, save as. Let's go and save this thing here as queries versus parameters PBIX. Okay, so it's going to be the completed name. I'm just going to replace that. And what I'm going to do at this point in time is I am going to publish this to Power BI because we're not done talking about how parameters work versus queries. I'm just going to publish this to my workspace. So now, once this is done publishing, we're going to head over and take a look at it. And what we should see, of course, is that the report should look exactly like we see here. So if I go and pop over into Power BI, indeed, it does. Now, what I want to do is I want to show you the control that we have over our queries inside Power BI. So I'm going to go to See Related Content, and I'm going to go to the settings for the data set. Now, the first time that you publish here, you will probably have to come in and update your credentials. I had to do that in this case here, so just be aware that that's the case. But you'll notice that we have parameters right inside the data set here. Now, who gets these? The person who published the report, not the person that receives it, right? So keep that in mind. Remember how I told you that I had to write in here to use dev or prod in the description, even though I actually put in a drop-down list right there? That's because in the Power BI service, you do not get a drop-down list. So if you don't know what the options are that you're supposed to be using, or go use the text, you have no idea what these values are supposed to be, and then you have to start looking out for a whole bunch of other stuff. Hopefully, because you're probably the person that published it, you'll understand what the values are and what the implications are if you actually end up putting in prods instead, whether or not that'll actually work. The file path here, you'll notice, is available for me to put in. That's all fine, no big deal there. I'm going to leave that one as is. We'll talk a little bit more about why that's parameterized later and not queried. This is actually something I find really, really interesting, though. My start date and my end date, I cannot click inside this. These are not editable. And this is weird to me because the checkbox that I unchecked that made these not editable is it required, yes or no? So it says, no, it's not required. In that case, you're going to give or you're going to take what I already gave you. Forget it, which is interesting. But it leaves it visible to taunt you. What the hell? So it's just a little bit strange. If I'd left a checkbox set that you can change it, you would be able to override these. Now, the reality is there is absolutely no reason that you would need to override these because essentially they're just working for the internal component anyway. So is there validation in the Power BI service in any case, even without the drop down for dev or prod? Honestly, don't know. I haven't actually played with it that much to find out, and I don't really have enough time to run a full refresh on it. It's a good question. If somebody else knows, I would be curious. Outside of that, I'm going to have to actually give it a shot. What I'm going to do now, though, is I'm just going to apply this. I'm going to search for the parameters, so maybe it does. Actually, you know what? Let's find out. Let's go with prods. I don't actually have to click a refresh, so let me see. Yeah, that's not good. See, it looks like it just took it. That's not cool. So that's going to error in a refresh. I don't really like that at all. So, Henry, that's a great question, and I think that that's a concern there. You'd think that the dropdown would be presented here. I mean, I know that they can do dropdowns. Little surprised it's not there. Anyway, at this point in time, I've now set this to prod. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go hop back over to my workspace, and I'm going to go and try and find that query set, which is never where I expect it's going to be. Let me see if I can get my list this way here. There it is. Okay, cool. And now I'm going to go in here. I tried to refresh, but it doesn't look like anything's happened. So I'm going to go back to the related content, and I'm going to kick a refresh on the data set. Now, in my test earlier, this takes approximately 5 minutes, and I'm not going to sit here and watch it. So what we're going to do is we're going to hop back and we're going to look at another feature that actually happens with parameters versus queries, and that is around Power BI templates. So when I now go File, Save As, and I decide that I'm going to save this as a PBIT file for, I'm just going to call this one Queries versus Parameters PBIT, okay? The thing that comes and asks you at this point in time is give me a template description. So it is a good idea to tell people how to use your file. Okay. This is something that is super, super important to actually put in place. And when you go and you click OK, at this point in time, it will now seemingly do nothing. Okay. So here's the thing that I want to actually recognize at this point in time. If I jump back down over here, I'm going to jump into my folder where I'm keeping all of the individual components that I'm actually using here. I'm actually not going to use this one. I'm going to use this one here that uses that's complete. This is the completed example file for the entire thing, which you'll have access to. But the reason that I'm using this is because this has actually got a more complete description in that little box that you just saw. So when I double click on this, this is going to open inside Power BI. And I'm just going to go grab something here real quick so that I've got it ready to go. The text that you saw in that box is going to fill up very, very, very quickly. And it's important that you actually fill something in there because otherwise your user is going to have no idea what to do when they get here. Okay. This is where the description actually shows up. Okay. In this case here, you might want to check out the readme.txt file for some key steps to make this work, because you need to actually, in order to get this work, to have the proper files in the proper location. And I give you all the steps inside the README on how to do that. The interesting part around this is if you just cancel this and don't fill in all of the required information, and you go into transform data, there is nothing. Okay, so you can actually share a PBIX or PBIT file this way. There's nothing there if they don't put in the information. So that actually protects everything, all the queries, all the parameters, and everything else. Let me just reopen this now so that hopefully I can actually show you how this one works properly. So here we go. Come on, Power BI, go a little faster. You know, my machine is loaded for bear here, and it still doesn't run fast enough for me. Okay, cool. So we're going to go and we're going to drop in the file path to where my data is stored. It asks me, would you like Dev or prod? Notice that we have the checkbox right here. Every one of these items here, these are all of the little descriptions that we filled in for documentation. In this case here, it says if you're going to fill this in, make sure it's a valid January 1st date. I'm not 100% sure how to validate these things properly inside Power BI as much as I would in Excel. I would probably do some triaging and error handling on this. There's location or locales are going to be important here. This is the date format my system uses, and that's why I've used that. When I go and hit load at this point in time, it's going to go and it's going to try and load the data. The reason why I set dev as the default here is because I didn't want to accidentally hit prod and load all of my data. I actually wanted this to go a little bit quicker, okay? Once it actually finishes loading here, you'll see that it's going to create everything. The visuals, everything else should all be here. Boom, there we go. Everything looks good. Now I used a not quite as wide chart for this, but you'll notice that from my template, the data model is actually there. And if I go into transform data, what you'll notice is that all of the components are actually here. Now, the important part around this, if you were doing this on your system, your file path would show up here, and whatever you enter for your parameters would show up here. But notice that I do not get any chance to change the name of the file because this is a query and you do not get prompted for those, okay? I don't get a chance to override the scalar queries here or the simple queries here. What I wanted to make sure of is that when I deployed this file out to you, if you're trying to play along, you need to put in the SharePoint path to the files, but if you follow my instructions for the files themselves, I don't want you to be concerned with what the heck is the file name actually called. Was it underscore or a dash? Is that uppercase or lowercase? I've hard coded that. It's a constant, okay? It doesn't need to be changed. So you got to mix these things appropriately in order to make them right. All right, now, by this point in time, with any luck, if we go back over here, nope, okay, it's still refreshing. Oh, there we go, cool, nice. We've refreshed the data set just in time. And now I could go and do a little refresh here and you'll see that everything shows up nicely. So I have the ability to control parameters right inside Power BI without actually having to go back to the Power BI desktop file. Jennifer, does that mean you could use parameter as a password for your template? Unless you key in the right value, none of the contents appear. That's an interesting one. I don't think so, because I don't think we have a validation level on it in order to be able to say, does this match what I'm expecting it to actually be? And you can't lock Power Query. When saying no, you can't lock Power Query. I'm just thinking when with the templating, if you don't get things right, it shows up blank. But I think if somebody just backed in, you know, my dog has fleas, for the password field, there's nothing for us to validate whether or not that's a valid password. So it would then pop up and show up. So the other thing you should be aware of course, is that once you actually get into this, all of the queries that I'm actually using here inside this, they're all there. The entire logic is here. Like, this isn't protecting anything here. You got to be careful when you share the Power BI desktop file, because this is the business intelligence. If you're concerned about somebody using, about seeing this, you should be publishing it and sharing it through Power BI so that nobody can get into this scenario in the first place. That's kind of the whole concept behind why Microsoft charges money, is because they know that's the security feature. That's the part that's worthwhile. Okay. All right. Just to quickly round this out before I sort of close up this presentation, I'm back in the Power BI service. I've switched it to prod. I've hit refresh. Everything works. Okay. The only other thing I want you to be aware of here is that if I go back to my queries versus parameters thing here, and I go and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to go and add a new, I don't know, let's go and add a new visual for sales per category and item or something like that, so that we can drill into high values and whatever else on this kind of stuff. Okay, so we can start looking at the individual components. Did I not get item on there? Yeah, analyze. There we go. Let me move that up. No, all right, never mind. We'll leave it at this. So if I wanted to throw this in and I say, hey, cool, now I want to go and push my queries versus parameters. Remember, I'm in dev right now. That's what the parameter has been set to here. So if I now go save, and I now go and hit publish it to my workspace and overwrite what's actually out here with the report, it is taking these parameters with it. Okay, so when this gets published and I go back and I refresh this page, it's not using the prod. And if I refresh this thing, it's not using prod, because when we actually go back, when I republish this report, I go and take a look at my parameters over here, you'll see that it's actually reset to dev. So this is where I say, like, you know, setting up your default, dev may not be the appropriate thing to do here. The idea would be that you're going to do all of your development inside Power Query in dev mode, and then when you're ready to publish, you're going to flip it to prod here probably, and then publish it. Although you can switch it here if you need to, okay? And it's not dev or prod, you know, you might have different reasons for switching between different data sets here as well. Okay? So just sort of keep that in mind. All right, let me go back now and try and finish off a little bit of this stuff here. So let's talk a little about queries versus parameters. Oh, wow, this is Jordan. This is your first dive into Power BI, and you started with a complex topic like this. I would recommend starting easier, honestly, but I'm glad you're enjoying it. So let's talk queries, parameters. The differences between these things. So for me, benefits, queries. You can drive them dynamically from data very, very easily. Okay, right click and reference, do all your filtering, get it all the way down to a scalar value. Super, super easy to do with query. Now, we didn't look at Excel today, but one of the things that's super important to me about Excel, for those of you who come from the Excel background, is that you can actually change the value for a query in the Excel grid and hit refresh, and it just works. You don't need to go into Power Query in order to change it. This is how I generally use my air quotes parameters inside Excel, is control them through the Excel grid. Something else that's important to realize about your queries here as well is that the mechanics of your queries are preserved on release. Now, what the heck do I mean by that? It's kind of a weird wording. Whether your query is simple or complex, the M code is preserved when deploying the solution. Okay, so what that means is when I deploy it as a Power BI template, anything that's a query does not allow the user to prompt to change it. It comes out exactly the way that I've actually set it up, which is the way I want it. That's good. I love queries as parameters. Okay, this is my go-to most cases. The drawbacks, though, they're not recognized in the create function experience. If I can put this into blunt and very professional language, that sucks. Okay, I don't like that. I really wish they were, because I don't see any reason why they shouldn't be. Like, it's referring to somewhere else. Why can't you just, you know, allow that to be the case? But it's not. The other thing is that queries, and this one really just gets under my skin, as I've already mentioned, don't show in dialog dropdowns. And if it's a scalar query, it should show. That is my opinion. In Monkey Tools, when we actually go through and build wizards in order to deal with things, we evaluate what's a scalar query so that you can actually use scalar queries in the dropdowns in some of our forms, like calendar generators and things like that. We allow you to do that. I don't understand why Microsoft doesn't. That's something that I really think they should fix. Okay, that's my notes on queries. What about parameters? The benefits of parameters. Number one, they show in dialog dropdowns. Simple, just makes sense. They enable the create function dialog properly. Okay, cool. Simple, makes sense. You can update your parameters from Power BI interfaces the way you should be able to, meaning from the Home tab in Power BI Desktop and from within the Power BI service. This, and there's going to be on the slide later on, that you cannot do this from Excel. If you want to change the value in a parameter in Excel, you must enter Power Query. You can't do it from the Excel ribbon. This is a travesty, and it actually completely destroys a lot of the goodness of parameters. And this is one of the reasons why it was really, really hard for me to fall in love with parameters, because generally I do 90% of my work in Excel. And that's, I say, like, I'll avoid them at all costs because I can actually derive it from the Excel grid using a query, okay? But in Power BI, they're a first-class citizen. They work the way they're supposed to, and that's awesome. The other thing you should know with benefits, we just saw when you deploy a Power BI template, the parameter is cleared and the user has to enter something. So they don't see the data that you don't want them to see. The drawbacks of them, dynamic values are very, very difficult to get into a parameter, and they're fragile when you do, because if somebody comes along and goes, ooh, that looks like an interesting box that I can input something in, and they go and type something in, they hit enter, boom, your parameter is toast. It's no longer dynamic. It's not toast. No longer dynamic. If they go in and manage the query and hit OK when they've got it selected, it wipes it out and resets it with null values. Boom, problem. Okay, so very, very fragile. So I would suggest that even though everybody loves, as I say, it's a really popular page on my blog for how to actually do it, I actually don't recommend you do. Okay, so just because you can do it isn't a good reason to do it. And then just to sort of underscore this point, because it needs to be on the drawback side, Excel, you can only update your parameters via the Power Query interface. As again, I think it was Santosh that said, I do not like to send my users into the Power Query interface. I agree. As a matter of fact, if I could lock the Power Query interface, I would do that. That's something that Win had mentioned that you can't do. I really wish you could. But you know what? That's what Power BI is for. Sharing. Okay, that's my sort of quick comparison there. Now the big question comes down to, which way do you go when you're actually building a solution? Which one do you actually use when? So this is going to be another comparison slide, and I do want you to be aware that what I'm going to give you right here is my general rule of thumb. These are not hardcore rules that should never be accepted. Okay, what your solution leans towards is what your solution needs. Okay, what you think it is. So keeping that in mind, let's talk about scalar queries. Okay, they resolve to one value. These are fantastic for dynamically driven scenarios. Earliest, latest data points, min-max values, values that you want to feed into a filter that are driven by data. Okay, those kind of things are fantastic. Knock up a scalar query. Yeah, it's kind of a pain to get it into the drop-down areas that you need to. You got to put in a value and then replace it with the name of your query. But these things are fantastic for that. Okay, super, super good because you can drive it from your data. Simple scalar queries. Now we're talking the flat, I'm going to enter something very, very simple. These are good for constants. Okay, file names. Organization level file paths or URLs are really, really good for simple scalar queries. Things that do not change that are okay if you deploy your Power BI template that people see. Okay, that's where those ones are really, really good. So in the case of the solution that I just built, for example, you'll note that you would, if we go back to this one here, the file names for the 2013 file and for the all file for the chits, those ones are constants. I don't want you guys to have to manipulate them because they match up with the data files that I use. So I'm going to use those for a simple scalar query. Simple, flat, one step, boom, done, finished. Okay. Now, what about parameters? Parameters in Power BI are awesome for driving custom functions. As a matter of fact, they're awesome in Excel for driving custom functions too. Okay, this is the one thing that actually made me fall in love with parameters is the fact that I can actually use them to preserve sample transforms. One of the things that, I mean, if you've read M is for Data Monkey, you know I show people how to make custom functions and I showed them how to do it, turn them back into debugging mode, but you lost the ability to actually, it blew up all your other queries until it was out. This whole thing with parameters here, this is magic. Being able to have that sample transform, when you make changes in it, it automatically rolls it into the function. Absolutely fantastic. Parameters, wow, for that, perfect. Okay, that's where we definitely want them. Items needing runtime control in Power BI, your dev prod flags, those ones are super, super good. Anything that you want to be able to change from that interface without entering Power Query, that's where parameters are really, really good. In Power BI, as I say, if I'm doing this in Excel, I'm actually using scalar queries and driving it from the Excel worksheet because I don't have the ability from the Excel ribbon to change the parameters on the fly. If they give me that, I might change my opinion. Data to be customized for users are really good in parameters. Now, this is going to be interesting because if you compare this point against the bottom for the simple scalar queries, you'll notice that they're highly related. File paths, URLs, usernames, they're in the same place. And this is where it becomes really, really important to recognize that these are not hard and fast rules. You can mix these things up. If I were deploying to all of you and you all worked in my organization, I would use a simple scalar query for the SharePoint domain. What I wouldn't do, let's say that you were deploying it to OneDrive for Business, which actually has your username in the URL. What I would do is I would actually say, well, let's use a scalar query, a simple scalar query for the main body of the URL. Let's use a simple scalar query for the file name and the actual path where it belongs, or maybe not the path actually, the subpath. But for the username and the subpath, what we would do, or the folder that it's in within your OneDrive for Business, that we would use a parameter because we want you to provide that, but we know that the tenant name is always going to be the same. You'd mix and match those things up. Okay, so just keep that in mind. The other thing is for storing sensitive data, API keys. Never put your API key in a simple scalar query and release your solution. Okay, that is bad news because now you've just emailed out your API key to everybody that gets a handle on that file, and typically API keys cost money. Okay, Eric's asking, how complex can you make that single step in the scalar query and get away with it? The simple scalar query itself is simple and scalar. It's just one step. Okay, we're not dynamically creating anything. What we do is when we actually get, and actually let me just run back into Power BI here for a second and just show you real quick. So when we actually look at this, the simple scalar query is this, and maybe we have another one that is, let's say, for example, if I wanted to create something that was the beginning of my my URL, so I'm going to go create a new blank query here. I would put in this, and I would just call that, base URL, for example. Okay, so if I want to use that in a more complex scenario, I'm not going to make these complex. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to Chits dev, and I'm going to put all these things back together, concatenate them together here with the and in between. Okay, so it's not a let in that that does a whole bunch of stuff inside this guy here. There is a let and an in. Okay, there always is in a query. Okay, but that's all we get. Just a let and an in, and basically everything's done there. I'm not going to do a whole bunch of magic here. It can't have multiple steps. Okay, so just keep that in mind when you're going through that particular part there. Build those simple, happen together later on. Okay. Again, that API key, I mean, that one's comical. I don't know that I would recommend storing passwords in this. I don't think that's a good idea. I mean, I guess you could potentially put your username and password for something to log into a site. If you deploy it as a template, you can get the person to put in their own password. The reason why I don't like that, though, is it's clear text, which means that it can potentially be seen if it's sent over the internet. APIs or API keys are generally clear text, but they're passed to a URL in plain text anyway. So there's usually not a big issue around that. Anyway, that's my sort of general rule of thumb as to which ones I would lean to when I'm taking Power BI. As I say, the only big difference is the items needing runtime control. If I'm in Excel, I'm going to go to a scalar query instead. All right, that's it for the stuff that I have on this. I'll just throw you some quick resources here. If you're interested in learning more about how to work with, actually, I've got a great custom function chapter, chapter 17 in Master Your Data. If you're interested in learning about this stuff, this one actually goes through and shows you how to build queries using parameters. It shows you how to build them manually, and it shows you how to build the FN get parameter function so you can actually pull scalar queries to act as parameters inside Excel. We teach all that kind of stuff in the Power Query Academy as well. And if you're interested, I actually have recipe cards built for a lot of these things that we actually sell as a recipe card subscription. You can find all of these guys at skillwave.training in our shop here. The two on the outside are obviously a much lower price than this guy, but this guy in the middle, the Power Query Academy, actually includes a copy of each of these things, so you're aware as you go through. If you're interested in the stuff that I do, you like the stuff that I'm talking about and whatnot. JC says do it, and now I know he's part of the self-service BI bootcamp here and is really enjoying it. And Eric is also throwing in on that. So thank you guys, appreciate that. So. And Jordan, hey, thank you for plugging the Power Query Fundamentals course too. Look at you guys, like I planted you all here. Fantastic, thank you. So if you're interested in the stuff that I do, sign up for my newsletter. You do get 4 free ebooks, my top 5 Excel, Power Query, Power Pivot, and Power BI tips. We inform you of upcoming courses that I have, no matter where in the world or if they're online. Give you a monthly What's New email for Office and 365 or Office 365, Excel, Power BI. Tell you about new products, give you discounts, all the standard stuff that newsletters do. You can find the newsletter sign up link there. It is posted already live on the website. Sorry, that's not true. Here, I'll give you a link to this in a second. You can also find a whole bunch of my social media components here. And I'm just going to go and end off on this slide here as well. I will be posting a link to the OneDrive file where you can download this. This comes with all of the example files, the slides, and including this one here is in there as well. So you can find your links to all of these individual components later if you're looking for them as well.